Hello everyone, and welcome back to DeucesCracked.com. This is Andrew BalugaWhale Sideman back with another episode of my new series, Good Bluff, Bad Bluff, which has been going on for 5 episodes. This is the 6th episode we've got, and over the course of the series, we've kind of been slowly working our way from understanding what are bluffs in their fundamental form, why do we do them, when is it a good idea to do them, and we've sort of marched through from pre-flop, talked about pre-flop, talked about bluff raising the flop, talked about c-betting the flop, talked about raising the turn, talked about floating the flop, and now we are going to find ourselves all the way to the river, and sort of on the river we're going to sort of take a step back and discuss some new abstract conceptual things about what makes the river different, and we'll get to that in just a second. But before we get too far into it, let's go ahead and recap kind of the important information that we've had from the earlier sessions so that we don't end up leaving anything behind. So first, the idea of a bluff is a little bit more complicated than the idea of a value bet. Value bets sort of have this very, very cut and dry, safe definition that's just getting your opponent to call you or raise you with a worse hand. That happens, then you value bet. Bluffing can be a fair amount more complicated because bluffing, in its classic definition, would be getting your opponent to fold a better hand, but sometimes it's getting your opponent to fold a worse hand incorrectly, and so on and so forth. One of the reasons why today is going to be a little bit different is because there is no such thing as an advanced bluff, per se, or at least in the definition that we've been using for it on the river. But it's important to know kind of what those are going through. We also decided that if we're going to float something, that is sort of has to be with the intent to bluff, that we have to kind of be thinking about what is happening in the future, because even though we're just calling and we haven't done anything yet, obviously it's not a very good idea to be floating and then just giving up after you floated, because the whole point of floating was to try to steal the pot. We talked about bluff raising the flop and how much of a great price it is that we could get sometimes on bluff raising the flop, but how we have to be kind of aware of over bluffing, because our range on the flop will tend to be really, really, really wide. As will our opponents, which is why it's often a really, really great price. But we have to sort of be cautious with that. And we talked about how the turn, we didn't have as much of a concern of over bluffing, but it was still there because we're representing a more narrow range, even by getting to the turn, and certainly by raising the turn, it becomes more narrow. Now again, the price wasn't as cheap, but the price was still pretty good for raising the turn. We also have been talking a fair amount about whether or not you need to be balancing more than one range, i.e., can you just raise the flop with all of your value hands and like balance that range so you have only flop raises when someone plays against you? And the answer is, in some cases, it's definitely necessary. Like, we have to have both a flatting range on the flop with value hands and a bluffing range, and a value range for raising the flop. And bluffing range for both of those things, obviously. But that we don't have to balance just absolutely everything, because it's really pretty tricky to, let's say, balance your flop raise to 2x to 2.5 to 3x to 3.5 to 4, and to have some kind of a balanced range for all of those things. This is really, really difficult, and we kind of don't really need to or expect to do that unless we're playing against like ultra monster robots. So what about today? Today's discussion is going to be about bluffing on the river. Problem that happens when we have a decent hand and somebody bets, and all of a sudden we don't think our decent hand is so good anymore. We'll talk about sort of why it's hard to get to the river with bluffs, or why it's important to like be able to bluff on the river. I sort of mentioned this or alluded to this earlier, but when you're on the river, you're now over equity. Equity is done. One hand has won, the other hand has lost in terms of equity. The losing hand is drawing dead, obviously, because there's no more cards that can come to change things. So that sort of makes the river a different and unique situation. We're going to spend a lot of time today talking about frequency, what frequency is, and understanding how that works with image and representation. A lot of people talk about like, what am I representing with a bluff, or what is my opponent representing when he bets at me? And we'll discuss that for a little bit. And then lastly, we'll talk about kind of the polarization of running a bluff on the river. Polarization, of course, meaning you're sort of representing a really, really strong hand or a total bluff. Again, something that happens sort of naturally on the river when there's no equity. It's one thing when your opponent can have like combo draws and things like that on earlier streets, it makes it a lot easier to balance and be depolarized, or to have kind of a range that generally consists of pretty good stuff. But on the river, your stuff is either really, really good or it's not good at all. There's no more draws. And so polarization is something that naturally happens. And then we'll sort of discuss how the value of rebluffing against different player types might actually start to become a good idea as we get on to later streets. So, let's dive in head first, like Pete Rose. Okay, so a little history of I forgot to change the word from turn to river. That's too bad. So this is actually funny because the river is just like an exaggerated version of the turn. You could imagine that like the flop is really different from pre-flop, and it's really different from all the other streets because 3 cards come out, which changes things pretty massively. When there's only one more card to come, the odds of the board changing in a massive way is pretty unlikely. There's, even in like some boards where it might be like incredibly common or somewhat common, it still doesn't happen all that often from turn to river. So for example, let's say that the board comes down Jack 10-9 on the flop. Well, that's obviously a major change because a hand like maybe pocket aces might not be doing so well anymore on that type of board, whereas a hand like 8-7 suited that might have been doing really poorly before the flop now massively jumps way into the lead, and so on and so forth. But let's say that, for example, you have those aces and you bet the flop and get a call, and the turn card is a 3. Well, now there's lots and lots of things that could happen. Or sorry, there's only one more card to come, and so the only cards you're kind of really scared of are something like a queen or a king or an 8 or a 7. These are like really, really bad cards for you. But because there's only one more card left, it's not all that likely that it actually happens. That's about the worst case scenario ever. So the turn and the river are actually like somewhat similar in that sense, but sort of the evolution of the river bluff kind of follows the same lines as the turn, which is that essentially nobody ever bluff raised the turn, and even more so, nobody ever bluff raised the river. So the reason why like river bluffing kind of started to become a good idea once upon a time was because, well, let's even go take a step back before then. The reason why bluffing the river started off as a bad idea was because anybody who was putting out a big river bet generally had a really strong hand, and trying to get someone to fold a really strong hand was not a very good idea, because if everyone's playing based on their absolute hand strengths, they're just not going to be folding very many really strong absolute strength hands, no matter how strong your representation is. So anyway, it started off being a bad idea to bluff raise the river at all because everyone just had big hands they wouldn't fold. But then the good players started to find folds, which really gave them a big edge. And so people started bluff raising the turn, and then they eventually started bluff raising the river. And so then it became like, something that a good player had to have in their arsenal to do this. But even today, it's still somewhat rare to see too many bluff raises on the river, although I do think that that's something that like may change over time. This next question says, well, when is a bad risk reward actually a good one? Now, I remember back in the day, this guy, Ben Straat, Straate, who played as like Strat, was one of the first people to really embrace something that we'll talk about later, which we'll call the suicide bluff, which was, okay, sure, your opponent has like put a ton of money into the pot, has very little behind. It seems suicidal to try to get them to fold, so maybe you have like a bad risk reward there. But if you actually ever do get your opponent to fold, the price you give yourself, you risk so little money extra to win such a large amount that it ends up being like it can be a kind of a good deal. You could imagine thinking about like the river in some senses like the river in a limit hold'em pot. In limit hold'em, your opponents basically are always getting really, really, really good odds to call. So you would think that would actively discourage people from bluffing. But on the other hand, it actually really encourages people to bluff, because if they can never actually get their opponent to fold for 1/30th of the pot or something like that, the value or the price on that bluff is extremely, extremely good. Anyway, and the last thing that sort of happens here, and this is something that if you've ever played tournament poker, you'll understand. In tournaments, the all-in button is extremely, extremely valuable, and part of that is because or a big reason is that is because the extra money in the pot from antes and large blinds incentivizes everyone to play really, really, really aggressively. So basically that means that when people are sort of gambling and degenning and putting a lot of money in the pot with weak hands, generally the guy who decides to go all in first is the guy who wins. And so one advantage of like raising the river, for example, is you kind of can wait till your opponent puts a lot of money into the pot before you take advantage of it by going all in. Now, again, we're talking about risky maneuvers, but again, that sort of second point is important if the risk reward actually might be halfway decent. Okay, so the river is different. Why is the river different? Well, first, chance or luck or equity or whatever you want to call it is no longer a factor. It's not involved. Nothing else can happen that will suddenly drastically change the value of your hand in one direction or the other as it relates to the board texture. So all of this complicated but not that difficult if you were to actually sit down and do it stuff kind of goes away. And by that I mean all these situations where you're like, okay, well, my opponent has a range that consists of factors A, B, C, and D, and A has 80% equity against me, and B has 60% equity, and C has 40% equity, and D has 10% equity. And all of those things, he has them, let's say, evenly 25% of the time. So I'm getting XYZ pot odds, and you combine and compare all those things, and you could say, okay, that stuff is complicated, but it's not particularly difficult. You could sit down and just like write it out, and it would be totally fine. And sort of on the fly, we can eventually train ourselves to be decent at estimating those things. However, when we get to the river, all of those things that were really complicated but not too difficult get replaced by all of this like pretty simple but extremely difficult other stuff. And so by that I mean, okay, you say, oh, well, all I need to do is have my opponent be bluffing here 50% of the time, and it's okay to call. But then it can become quite difficult to say, well, is my opponent actually bluffing 50% here? That relies on some other things that are just outside of the realm of just math, and it boils down to frequencies. How well do you understand your opponent? How well do you understand what his range is likely to be doing? Not just what he has, but what he will actually do with it. A lot of the earlier part of the hand is about what does my opponent have? What does my opponent have? But the river is largely about what is my opponent going to do with what he has? Another way of saying that is what is my opponent's frequency? So when I talk about frequency, this is the definition that I mean. It's the number of times your opponent takes an action divided by the number of times your opponent could have taken that action. And it works both for value bets and bluffs. So to give you an example, if your opponent makes the nuts on the river against you and you bet half pot and he has less than a full raise remaining, so his only move if he's going to raise is to go all in. And so he will always go all in, right? 100% of the time, he will value bet if he has a hand, and he'll do it like that. He'll go all in. And by the same time, you could say, like, if a crazy person always bluffs, and that's his only option, he'll always go all in as a bluff there. So in this sense, frequency, at its sort of most exaggerated, simple answer, is not that complicated. But it gets a little bit more complicated pretty quickly. So let's say your opponent makes the nuts on the river, and you bet a half pot, but he's got 5 times the amount of the pot remaining in his stack, and he decides to go all in now. Well, now we can't exactly say he will always do this with the nuts, because some percentage of the time he might not go all in. He might make a smaller raise. He might make a medium-sized raise, right? Or maybe he would always do this with the nuts, or he wouldn't always do this with the nuts, except that now that he's like maybe tilting, or maybe he's there's some dynamic between you. Maybe you made a big call against him earlier. How is that going to affect what his raise size is? Does he go all in with wider things beyond just the nuts? Or is he flatting some of these weaker hands? How can we determine what he would do for each of his possible options? So this is actually quite challenging when it comes to what a frequency is. Essentially saying, our opponent may always raise with the nuts, but he might not always raise like this. Might not always do it just the exact same way. Which makes frequency quite challenging when your opponent has, like in limit, for example, your opponent has like not very many options. So you can just imagine, okay, my opponent's range is exactly this when he raises. He's always doing this thing when he raises. But in no limit hold'em, it's really, really complicated where your opponent has like 10 options, essentially, probably more. They could raise, they could, min raise. They could min raise plus some. They could min raise plus a medium amount. They could min raise plus a lot. They could overbet. They could flat. They have lots of things that they could possibly be doing in no limit that you couldn't really do in a limit game. So one of the problems that people have had with frequencies is the idea that every single spot that you play is going to be unique. And so this is something that is sort of invariably true. As you introduce more variables into a unique situation, the idea of calculating a frequency in that spot becomes more challenging. So this is one of the reasons why like I've had issues in the past with like heads-up displays and statistical elements and things like that, because somebody can tell you what someone's 3-bet percentage from the small blind is, but they can't tell you what someone's 3-bet percentage is in this small blind with you opening and XYZ people calling and the stack sizes being as such and the last 3 hands where these things happened and you're playing him on 4 other tables and maybe he's having a good month or maybe he's having a bad month or something like that. Right? So it's really hard to truly identify a frequency. But that's sort of what we decided is like the river is largely about just that. It's about knowing how often is my opponent going to bluff here, not how often could they bluff. So even in a live poker game, for example, it's really, really hard to identify a general frequency, but it may be really, really easy to identify one within this specific spot. And so what I mean by that is you introduce a lot of variables in a live game. What is someone's demeanor? What do they look like? What do they talk like? So on and so forth. So you might be able to say, I really think my opponent is always bluffing here and be totally right in a way you can't do in a live or in an online game. But by the same token, in an online game, you get kind of a mass collection of data that gives you a decent guess as to what's happening in general. So even though each spot, as I wrote here, is a unique snowflake, in practice, a lot of spots are similar enough that you can group them, identify them, and say, okay, I can actually sort of say that your frequency on this river probably consists of these things, and be relatively accurate, even though every spot is, in truth, unique. Man, I'm just talking today. I'm just talking fast. Okay. So one of the major factors in frequency is player type. What is somebody's base motivation for making a choice? So a bad passive player may never bluff the river at all, despite having lots of weak hands on the river, right? And this is sort of a relatively common situation. A bad aggressive player may bluff the river always, even though they very rarely have a nut hand. Those players are not controlling their frequencies. They're acting emotionally, right? The one person is too afraid to bluff. The other person is too excited and bluffs too much. They're emotional. Now, a thinking player may control their frequencies between 0% and 100%, but they're also not completely in control. I.e., even a good player is likely to be emotional and is likely to have some predilection or predisposition towards bluffing or not bluffing in any given type of spot. So I was talking with like a friend of mine who's quite a good player, and he was saying that like, man, I just feel like I must be so unbalanced on the river because like I always talk myself into, having this is the one hand that's like a good bluff spot. Like this is the hand that I'm going to do it. But every single hand that I play I end up talking myself into that and thinking like, okay, well maybe like this is the time, or this is the time I'll bluff, or the next time is the time I'll also bluff, it's just too easy to be emotional and to lose complete control of your frequencies so that you're not totally in control. But as I note at the bottom here, a robot is very much in control of its frequencies. A quick aside about the whole Claudico thing. A robot will eventually beat people in No Limit Hold'em. This is certainly true. But I think that probably the scientists for I think it's Carnegie Mellon, probably severely underestimated the level of human advancement in this field over the last few, even the last like 5 years or so, in terms of finding game theory optimal like solutions and practicing in those spots. So it's not really a surprise to me that the humans are kind of crushing it. Um, but it will be interesting to see what happens in the very end. The sort of key advantage of a robot is that the robot has like a very, very tight grip on what its frequencies should be in varied cases. But the humans, even though they may have less of a tight grip on it, they also might be just better at constructing those frequencies in the first place. So even though they might waver more, they're just on target at the beginning more often, if that makes any sense. Okay, so a thinking player. God, my typos are so bad. It's really embarrassing. Sorry, everyone. Um, a thinking player will be using history to try to get his head wrapped around your frequencies. So if I play against someone that I know has bluffed me a lot before, somebody who maybe has taken certain spots as bluffs, I'm going to be assuming that their frequency would be much higher in those spots. So if I'm putting myself in the thinking player part at the beginning, so I'll use the history to guess what you're doing. A thinking player will also use history to adjust to what has happened to just my own game. So what I mean by this is, let's say, for example, that you and I are playing, and I run a big bluff against you, and you call, right? Well, I could use the history there and say, okay, like you're somebody who likes to call in some of these big spots. So my guess is that your frequency is to call a lot, and I'll probably bluff more or bluff less and value bet more, right? Then you might say, well, I will use this history to say, I think that you bluff too much, and so I'm going to call more, and I might win this conflict because my adjustment is to assume that you will call more, and your adjustment is to assume that I will continue that I bluff too much. And so it's just easy for well, in this case, one of the persons just kind of wins by adjusting his frequencies. We're going to come back to this sort of leveling idea in a little bit, but before then, I want to sort of discuss this sort of comment down here, which is to say a non-thinking player will not care about histories or frequencies. How does all this work? So here's the thing about non-thinking players. Getting a bad passive opponent to fold their error is really easy. They don't care. Getting a bad aggressive player to fold error is kind of hard. Getting a bad aggressive or passive player to fold any kind of a made hand is extremely difficult. But getting thinking players to fold hands, either made hands or air, is a much more subtle thing. I stress this, even made hands or air, because thinking players are often not even so worried about the absolute strength of their hands. They're more worried about, like, what are you representing and how am I doing against that? So oftentimes air hands may be kind of hard to get your opponent to fold if they're doing pretty well in thinking. So this is the quick disclaimer before we move on, which is that non-thinking players don't care about frequencies, ranges, history, or image, so don't try to make them fold made hands in cash games. We're going to talk about some crazy ideas throughout the course of this video. Don't try to make them fold made hands in cash games. In tournaments, it's probably a good idea to try to get them to fold stuff sometimes. Probably not early in the tournament, though. But later on, it could be okay. So I'll just continue this before I click the next button. The reason for this is because you need so much more fold equity to get someone to fold a made hand, and a cash game you just don't have it. But a tournament actually builds in some extra elements that increase fold equity, so it actually could work in that situation. Okay. So let's talk about this idea of getting your opponents to fold a hand, made hand, non-made hand, obviously. So because we're talking about getting our opponents to fold a made hand, we know we have to be talking about thinking players and not about bad players, because trying to get bad players to fold hands is a pretty rare occasion. So we're talking about playing against a thinking opponent who will be scrutinizing our range. So sometimes our range will appear to contain a lot of bluffs. So the example that I write here is that you are opening on the button and the flop comes down queen 7-3 and you see bet. That's a spot where your range is going to have tons and tons and tons of bluffs. Sometimes your range will have lots and lots and lots of value hands. For example, you raised the river, he bets, and you go all in on a queen 7-3-5-6 board. And you don't really represent very many bluffs at all. You represent basically mostly just straights and sets and things like that. One of the biggest, sort of in my book, I discussed this with something called the either or chapter. But one of the ways you can actually make sure that you are difficult to play against is you have to ask yourself, how many bluffs do I actually have here in any given spot? So let's say, for example, that you have queen 10 on this queen 7-3-5-6 board and your opponent bets the river. Well, how often do you ever bluff raise this river all in? Right? What would be the kind of hand that would be a good idea to do that with? Would queen 10 be one? What about something like pocket 8s? If I had pocket 8s here, I might view calling the turn like a pretty good idea to try to get your opponent to fold whatever he has on the river. You just have lots of blockers on a lot of river cards. So if your opponent is thinking about what you have, and that's bolded there, and if the answer is 0, that you have no bluffs in a spot, that's usually an indicator that it actually might be kind of a good time to go ahead and try a bluff in that spot. We talked about this last video as well, but the general key to running good bluffs against thinking players is to be bluffing in spots where you have a lot of value hands, and then the reverse obviously being true, which is to be having a lot of value hands in spots where you represent a lot of bluffs. So it's a great idea to c-bet the flop with a hand like, say, pocket queens on this queen 7-3 board, where you represent a ton of air. You're likely to get your opponent, if he's thinking, to play back with lots and lots and lots of things. But if you bluff, with, let's say, I don't know, king 4 on this queen 7-3 board every time, you're going to have too many bluffs, and it's going to be too easy for your opponent to basically play well against you. And if you never, ever, ever raise anything but the nuts on this queen 7-3-5-6 board, you might also be making a mistake, because your opponent might correctly fold a hand like pocket 7s to you on the river when you go all in. Which would be like a pretty big disaster for you if you had, let's say, a straight. You would essentially guarantee that you cannot get paid by anything. Right? What if your opponent has pocket 3s and is going to go bet, but fold to an all-in on the river? That seems like a spot where you could be extremely effective against your opponent, but if you're never bluffing in a spot like that, you just simply won't have it. So, every time we talk about a bluff, we have to consider the price for a minute. So I want to sort of adjust our board that we had just a second ago and give ourselves queen 10 again and sort of walk through this hand. So the board comes down. So let's just say hypothetically that our opponent has raised and we've called on the button, and the flop has come down queen 7-3, giving us top pair and a backdoor flush draw. And our opponent bets and we call, and the turn card's a 4 of spades, giving us a flush draw, and our opponent bets again and we call, and the river card is the 5 of diamonds, meaning that basically we bricked our flush draw. We just have top pair. And our opponent bets 2/3 pot, so 30 big blinds into a pot of 45 big blinds, making the total pot 75 big blinds. And your opponent has about 45 big blinds remaining in his stack at this point. Okay. So you figure that your opponent will do this with a range that looks something like sets, certainly, 2 pairs, probably, some things like 5-4 suited, 7-5 suited, maybe, stuff like that. Maybe some overpairs, things like aces, kings, ace, queen might try to get super thin value here. Some bluffs, so you could have things like the ace, jack of spades, ace, 8 of spades. You could have something like ace 5, that river to 5 or something like that. It's possible. And then he's got a handful of combinations of really nut hands like 8-6, 7-6, 5-6, pocket 6s. Okay. So, at our first glance, we kind of look at the ranges and we're like, okay, well, our hand is probably not good. Against this range of aces, kings, queen, aces, kings, sets, ace, queen, 2 pairs, straights, and only a handful of bluffs, our hand's not good. We kind of tend to address these situations in a very call or fold type of situation instead of what it really is, which is like a raise or fold situation. You could actually consider this in some ways very similar to getting dealt a hand like ace-7 offsuit before the flop and having your opponent raise. If your opponent raises, you're kind of not really thinking call or fold ever. You're thinking, okay, my hand isn't quite good enough to call, so it's either a raise or a fold. And the raising calculation is quite easy once you decide that your hand is not good enough to call with. So in this case, if we were to go all in, which seems to be the only like a real reasonable raise size here, because a min raise would be essentially pretty close to an all in, we would risk, although actually come to think of it, a min raise might be superior. I don't know. If it causes your fold equity to go down at all, it might be bad. But anyway, it's interesting to think about, though. Certainly. So if you go all in, we risk 75 big blinds to win 75 big blinds. Right? There's 75 big blinds in the pot, and we have to put in 30 plus another 45 to do that. And so in order to do that, we basically are doing this. And this is titled the suicide price because the price is, it's pretty good, actually. Our opponent just needs to fold half the time for us to break even. And if we were to march out all of the combinations here of the things we thought our opponent was likely to have, if we assume that he folds everything but a 6 on this board, which I think is somewhat reasonable, you might actually start to find enough combinations here to say, well, actually, if my opponent folds every combination of aces, kings, ace, queen, queens, 7s, 3s, 4s, 5s, 7, 5, 4, 5, etc., you might say, actually, that's probably enough combinations if he folds all those things to make bluffing here really, really effective. But this is the real question. Once you think about it this way and you break it down, okay, well, this is how much I have to risk versus this is how much I have to win. So how often does my bluff need to work to break even? And then you say, well, do I think that it actually will? And then here's what we have at the bottom. So you have this. You have this list of things you have to consider before you can pull the trigger on something like this. So they are the player type. Because obviously, if we're talking about a bad passive player or a bad aggressive player, it's extremely unlikely they're going to fold a hand like ace-queen or pocket queens or something like that. Image. If you're trying this against a regular, but you run crazy bluffs like this all the time, and your opponent just knows that you will turn any one pair or two pair hands into an all-in bluff on the river, then it might not be super good because your opponent might kind of accidentally back into nailing your range correctly there. Frequency. Does your opponent actually bet this way with all those hands? Because if your opponent decides to, let's say, check aces and kings and check ace-queen, or bet like a quarter pot with pocket kings or with two pair or something like that, then we have a real problem, because if our opponent's frequency here is heavily tilted towards the nuts, then our bluff is not going to work often enough. And then compare all those things with the price. How often does it need to actually work? What does it look like? And then pull the trigger. So there are some times where your opponent might put himself almost all the way all in. But if you think that he has a really, really wide range, it might be a good idea to try to run a rebluff. So in this example, we talk about how to actually like get a regular or a thinking player off of a hand. The only time that it's a good idea to bluff against a bad aggressive player is on the river in spots like this, where your opponent might actually just have a hand like ace-8, and might fold. Let's say we don't even need to have a hand like queen 10. We might have a hand like, say, I should have made this board more interesting, put a flush draw on the flop, but we might have a hand like, say, ace jack. Well, that's probably not. Yeah, something like, let's say, ace jack of spades that called the flop on a float, that called the turn with the nut draw, and then we maybe actually be able to get our opponent to fold a hand like jack 3 that he might barrel off on the river, but then fold for a very small amount of additional money. He may not, though, which is kind of why it's not a good idea to do this against bad aggressive players too often. But if there's anyone we'd want to do this against in terms of rebluffing, it might be a bad aggressive player once he sort of put a ton of money into the pot with a hand that he might actually just have total garbage, like total air. This hand sort of exemplifies what I view as a major problem that people have with the concept of showdown value. So you often find yourself, when you have a quote-unquote showdown value hand, with kind of a bluff catcher in a spot where your opponent doesn't quite have enough bluffs. So that queen 10 example is a pretty good one, which is to say, our opponent may have some bluffs. He may turn a hand like ace-5 that river to pair into a bluff, or he may have like a turned flush draw like the ace-jack of spades that he would turn into a bluff or something along those lines. But there's probably not enough combinations of those relative to all of the value hands for you to actually make a call But even so, we have this tendency to think about, I have a value hand, I have a showdown value hand, I have a 1-pair hand, I have ace high, I have a low 2-pair kind of thing, and think to yourself, well, I have showdown value, so I'm either playing call or I'm playing fold if I can't win enough. But the order of operations should usually go something along the lines of, what does raising look like first? And then after that, okay, we're calling and folding. So avoid the temptation to find yourself into this call or fold zone on the river, especially against thinking players. Now, against passive players, we should usually just be in a fold zone. We don't really want to be putting more money in the pot when our opponents are passive and they're being aggressive against us. If our opponent is a really, really aggressive player, we usually want to be in the call or raise zone, because we would ideally try to not get to the river very often with hands that we're likely to fold. And then if we're playing against a thinking player, we don't want to be in the call or fold zone, because our opponent is kind of likely to be thin value betting us a lot. And if our opponents are thin value betting quite thinly, but are, let's say, maybe able to make big folds, we could actually probably get away with having some successful raises. So avoid the temptation to play call or fold when your opponent is likely to be thin value betting you, and go with and sort of go with the more aggressive option or fold more often than you think. Okay. I believe that mostly does it for, that'll do it for this week's video. Coming up next time, I realized that I had this at the end of last week's video as well, but we didn't quite get to it. Next time, we're going to be talking about kind of interesting and unorthodox bluffing ideas. Things like, should we donk bet on the flop, donk bet on the turn? Should we do things like double floating? How do those things work? Floating out of position, is that an option? Hood stuff pre-flop. There's a lot of options for sort of what you might call unorthodox bluffs that we can definitely take a peek at. But I think this is a good kind of discussion of, once you're in an aggressive game and more money is going in on later streets with weaker hands, this all-in button on the river starts to become really, really valuable for bluffing. Just make sure that you're monitoring the player type, you're monitoring the frequency, and that you kind of make sure you have the right price before you pull the trigger on something so large. Anyway, hopefully you guys have enjoyed this. This has been Andrew BalugaWhale Sideman. I'm only here on DeucesCracked.com. And I will see you guys next time with more discussions of different types of bluffing. But until then, drop a comment in the comment thread, and I will see you guys next time. Good luck.